Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to get started in just a few minutes while we're waiting for people to show up, and then we're going to get going.
It's not just one bad apple. The whole damn tree is rotten. I think when people hear that we're anti-police, they think it's going to be chaos. The new abolitionist movement it's about transformative justice, non-prison, non-police-based strategies for dealing with violence and crisis in our communities. Who hasn't had a bad day? Who hasn't felt anxious or depressed? The question is, should anybody deserve to die because of it? The police's sole responsibility is to manufacture criminals. So here you have for-profit prisons. When you create space, you create a demand. That means that bodies have to fill those prisons. And we have seen that it's largely transgender people, it's Black people, it is Native people, it's Latinx people. When you have that demand, then you also have to create incentives. That trickles down to police, who also now have the incentive of creating criminals. It's not about justice anymore, it's about profit. I think we start with the demilitarization of the police. Police don't need assault weapons to protect people. The second thing that we can do is really look at police budgets and create models and economies for that divestment from the institution of policing and the reinvestment in community models. That means taking money out of police budgets and slowly phasing out police because we don't actually need them in our communities. They don't keep people safe. You know, when you're looking at it from the lens of race in this country, country. It's absolutely easier to manufacture criminals around that. When people's skin becomes weaponized, particularly black skin, a book becomes a gun, a cell phone becomes a gun, a bag of Skittles becomes a gun. We don't have some personal war with individual police officers. What we do have is deep concern and a fight against the institution of policing. Undocumented communities know that they can't call the police in the event that crisis happens. A lot of black communities know that too. And so entire mosques, churches, communities, they have agreements where they won't call the police should something happen. And in its place, we've seen such a wonderful and diverse response when it comes to intervention in our communities. We've seen people rise up with trainings around mental health crisis, intimate partner violence crisis. We've seen rapid response justice teams, and I think that's really what we need to be building. Revolution isn't just the ending of something, it's the beginning of something new.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Michael. I'm with CDSA, and I want to start by thanking you all so much for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about abolition, community control, and defunding the police. The community control part of our webinar title here is that Civilian Police Accountability Council, or CPAC legislation here in Chicago. Tonight, we're going to be talking about how abolition and defunding campaigns interact with CPAC. Of course, we want to give a shout out to Carper, given that CDSA's work on CPAC is being done in service and support of Carper's organizing. CPAC organizing strategy is owned by Carper, and we move in support of them. Later in this presentation, we have a panel with Carper co-chair Frank Chapman and Rodman Peterson, co-chair of CDSA, on our topic for this evening as well. Before we get into how CPAC relates to this evening's topic, I just want to briefly dive into the why of police defunding and the why of police abolition. Police abolition is an ongoing practice and study. We could truly devote an entire school semester to police abolition as a topic. Just a few of the foremost scholars and activists who have been working for decades on police abolition in both academic and activist spaces include Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and Miriam Kaba. Organizations that have been working on police abolition include Critical Resistance, which was started in 1997 by Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and also the many organizations in the recently formed Black Abolitionist Network here in Chicago. A real misconception about police abolition is that it's an all-at-once process, that abolition means just removing police all at once and leaving a void in their stead. What do abolitionists actually do? What does the work look like? Abolition is actually a process, and the process is the work that abolitionists do. One step in this abolition process is police defunding, defund the police. An expanded definition of that is redirecting money from police and to communities. Defunding is only a truly only an abolitionist step when it's a very deep and transformational cut. Whether it's 75% or another percentage, the abolitionist goal is to eventually get to 100%. While these cuts are occurring, we then move money away from the racist and brutal institution of policing to programs that are actually effective. And we also take those resources and invest them in the design of a fundamentally new, more effective and anti-racist model for public safety without police. Now I want to take a brief moment to talk about Aid to Abolition. Aid to Abolition is a plan that is a documented series of steps towards abolition. As you can see, defund the police is only step one in the top left corner there. Other steps are removing police from schools, freeing people from jails and prisons, and investing in social programs. It becomes even more obvious from looking at this graphic that the plan that abolition is this multi-step process with many different components and many different steps. Why do we need abolitionist steps like police defunding instead of police reform? Simply put, pouring money into reform hasn't worked. A few tragic, heartbreaking examples. 8 Can't Wait is a police reform campaign that's being pushed right now from other organizations. In Chicago, nearly all 8 proposals were in effect when LaCon McDonald was murdered by the police. In Minneapolis was a poster child for new police training and new police reform when George Floyd was murdered. In New York, the use of chokeholds by police was already illegal when Eric Garner was murdered by the police. So these reforms didn't stop the violence or the murders. Reforms that don't work eat up our time, money, and resources. major police training initiatives that have been implemented decades and decades, for decades and decades. Reform ends up draining public resources as we try again and again. An example of this is we had to wait while body camera data came in and showed us that in many cases, body cameras, a big reform that lots of people pushed for a long time, that they don't substantially reduce police violence. Meanwhile, the brutality and the murder continued. That money and those resources could go into supporting effective violence reduction solutions like programs like mental health care and like social workers. Abolitionists want to take transformational steps because abolitionists dream of a better world, where resources go to the communities, programs, and people who need them, and where the brutal racist institution of policing has been abolished and removed from the equation. We can get to that world by fighting for abolitionist steps like police defunding, and in Chicago, CPAC is essential to achieving this. Now I want to hand this off to Courtney, who's going to talk a little bit about why our organization, DSA, is involved.
Thanks, Michael. My name is Courtney, and I'm going to be speaking a bit about why police abolition is a socialist cause. To start, I want to amplify something that was said at the last CPAC political education event, CPAC 101, by panelist Alderman Carlos Rosa. In response to a question about his position on abolition in relationship to CPAC, Rosa put it very simply that, quote, "I am a socialist, so I am an abolitionist." To those who are not new to abolitionist work, the overlap between socialist and abolitionist demands might be that simple to see and act on. In this section, I will highlight some of the simple concepts that explain why a socialist analysis ultimately requires abolition and abolitionist demands as part of our fight for a better world. At its most simple, as socialists, we hope to end the violence, destruction, and inequity inherent to capitalism. From their development, capitalism and white supremacy are unfortunately inseparable. Their mechanisms and impacts have been intertwined and reliant on each other from their origins. Capitalism relies on the exploitation of labor to collect profits from for those in power. Land and resource theft, slavery, imprisonment, criminalization of racial groups through segregation, poverty, and immigration, among many other violent mechanisms, have been at the core of leveraging labor into profit. One metaphor that is sometimes used to explain the relationship between capitalism and white supremacy is, if capitalism is flour and racism and white supremacy are eggs, and you bake a cake that is the current racial capitalist system we live under, it's not productive or even possible to dig into that baked cake and just remove the eggs or the flour alone. If we want to end capitalism, we must also end white supremacy. We need a whole new cake. Police and prison developed in tandem with this racist capitalist system. The earliest prisons were debtors' prisons. Earliest police have their roots in slave patrols in America. And police have always worked to support, cover up, and protect people who do violence in the name of white supremacy and capital. Police function overall to protect private property and the state monopoly on violence. As socialists and labor organizers, we might ask, but what about police unions? Aren't cops workers? And as socialists, we need to be very clear that no, cops are not workers, and them and their unions do not belong in the labor movement. Unlike laborers who contribute value to society that is stolen from them by capitalists, police function primarily to enact violence on behalf of the state in the name of protecting the state's monopoly on that same violence. Beyond this, police also have a very rich and well-documented history of actively working against the labor movement and broader working class by breaking strikes, using intimidation and brute force, serving and enforcing evictions by removing people from their homes, as well as enacting political repression, as witnessed repeatedly over the last few weeks and months at protests across the country. It has been said by many, but if police are willing to use unnecessary and egregious violence at protests aimed exactly at protesting police abuses of power, they are obviously comfortable in their role to enact violence with no oversight or consequence. This is largely because police unions and the politicians they work with have unfortunately been incredibly effective in ensuring cops have many layers of legal protection from accountability. Locally, the Chicago Federation of Labor does not include the Fraternal Order of Police. Across the country, a number of labor unions have called and voted for the ejection of police unions from broader union coalitions. We support these calls to eject police unions from the broader labor movement. The CDSA labor branch has recently held a political education event on this topic in particular and discussed the history of police unions and have compiled a useful reading list on the topics that we will circulate at the end of this presentation as well. As Michael started to mention in the previous section, as socialists and abolitionists, we hope to undermine both capitalism and racism by achieving democratic control over our collective resources that can allow us to build a better world by taking care of each other rather than locking each other up. CPAC is a necessary step to ensure that we can defund the police and redistribute those funds to systems of care, including education, housing, medical and mental health care, amongst many others. Finally, achieving socialism and abolition will require the power of a multiracial mass mobilization of the working class to take our power back from capital and from the wealthy who currently control the state and enact violence in support of exploiting laborers. For CDSA, this means that we will necessarily need to continue building strong coalitions with anti-racist and abolitionist organizations that are working in Chicago. As we have mentioned, we are following Carper's lead in organizing for mobilizing support of CPAC. CDSA has also recently voted to establish a committee to defund the police, chapter priority campaign to defund the police and fund our communities, and our work to achieve CPAC will fall under this broader committee and be a crucial part of the demands. Other demands we will be pursuing include a 75% reduction of the police budget this fall, as well as a removal of Chicago Police Department from Chicago Public Schools. CPAC is an absolutely essential part of these overall abolitionist ends because just as we cannot trust police to inspect themselves or reform their violent behavior, we cannot put the process of defunding in the hands of the police. We need a democratically elected and accountable community control to enact our defunding demands. And with that, I will pass it to Valerie to further discuss how CPAC is essential to abolition.
Thank you, Courtney. So, if abolition is our goal, how does CPAC fit into it? CPAC is a mechanism we can use to win our demands and therefore a necessary step on the road to abolition. A number of organizations like Carper, Black Abolitionist Network, Black Lives Matter Chicago, and many, many more all support CPAC because many larger abolitionist demands can be accomplished through it. CPAC takes power over the police out of the hands of the few, like the mayor, and puts it into the hands of the community. Cops and others associated with policing will not be able to serve on the committee since there would be an obvious conflict of interest. Politicians will do whatever they can to avoid defunding or dismantling the police, but CPAC would be able to make meaningful changes regardless of what the mayor wants. A recent example of slimy politicking is New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. He pulled a political maneuver in which he claimed to have cut $1 billion from the city's $6 billion police budget. However, critics have pointed out that much of the fund reductions are just a sleight of hand, like projecting that NYPD will significantly reduce its overtime costs, even though limits on the overtime police can file are routinely exceeded. The budget also transfers the $400 million budget burden of police resources spent on school safety agents from the NYPD to the Department of Education, which does not change the presence of cops in schools. Another example is the mayor of Los Angeles stating that he would remove $150 million from the LAPD budget. Turns out he just reduced the number of bonuses that were going to be added to the budget for the following year, but the police budget will still be higher next year than it was this year. Finally, it's important to note that even if a mayor or city council believes in defunding and significantly cuts the budget, there is no guarantee that it won't be raised back to the same level or higher by a new governing body later on. CPAC would institute and maintain budget cuts, regardless of who is in charge of the city. So, how does CPAC shift power away from the police? Clearly, there are many important differences between the current failing system and CPAC. The main difference is power over certain key aspects of policing. Let's dive into some of these. First, CPAC will be able to appoint the police superintendent, the police board, and the administrator of COPA. Under CPAC, police oversight will be in the hands of democratically elected officials who will be accountable to their communities. In the current system, the mayor, police superintendent, and members of the police board fail to hold the police accountable. Since CPAC will be responsible for appointing these figures, the people calling the shots will be accountable to CPAC, who are in turn accountable to the communities who elect them. Next, CPAC will have final review power over police policies. There are several policies that CPAC could decide on, such as when force can be used or what kind of weapons are allowed and which are not. This means CPAC could choose to disarm the police, which would significantly reduce the amount of harm they can do, though obviously it would not be enough to eliminate murder by the police. CPAC would also be able to remove cops from schools by terminating that contract. Next, CPAC would have control of the budget. This is where CPAC will be able to directly reduce the police budget. BAN has called for a 75% reduction, which Chicago DSA has recently adopted as a chapter-wide campaign. The demilitarization of police could also be accomplished by CPAC by not allocating funds for advanced weaponry. Finally, CPAC would have accountability powers. The council would be able to petition for a grand jury investigation into police criminal activity and investigate misconduct. Obviously, these are often covered up, since in our broken police accountability system, we continue to let the police investigate themselves. 2/3 of cases since 2017, including sexual assault cases, were referred back to the CPD's Bureau of Internal Affairs. It is no surprise then that the nearly 250,000 complaints made against officers over the past 30 years have resulted in only 128 firings. CPAC will also have final say over officer discipline. This will hopefully ensure that officers are disciplined and fired for misconduct before the behavior escalates to murder and assault. Ultimately, CPAC is a method to make sure steps toward abolition are actually taken, and once they are, they become incredibly difficult to undo by other political actors. In this sense, it would be a powerful first step, but the fight would not end there. We would need to ensure that the people elected to CPAC are abolitionists who will work towards defunding and ultimately dismantling the police. Abolition will not happen overnight, but as we rely less and less on police and shrink their scope of influence, the easier it is for us to begin to envision and create a better world without police. Now we'll transition to our panel discussion introduced by Tamer.
Thank you so much, Valerie. It's a real pleasure today. My name is Tamer Abuzaid, and I go by he or they pronouns. And it is a real pleasure today to introduce our panelists. We're going to go ahead and start them on video. Someone please start Frank's video as well. We have two panelists today who are talking with Frank Chapman, who is the executive director of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, and he's also the co-chair of CARPER, which is the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. Additionally, we have Robin Peterson, who is the co-chair of Chicago DSA, which of course, as you've heard, DSA just recently adopted a chapter-wide priority campaign to defund the police, which includes as one of its main demands passing CPAC here in Chicago. I'm going to ask for you to give me 1 second to make sure that Frank Chapman is with us on the line. There we go. All right, so everybody's here. Thank you very much. Thank you both of you for joining us. Frank, I'm going to start with you. There are always new people coming into this movement and who might not necessarily know some of the history behind it. So I wanted to first give you a couple of minutes to sort of explain to people what CPAC is and where the idea for CPAC came from.
Okay. CPAC is a democratic struggle led by mainly African Americans to have democratic control over our police. This movement did not start in Chicago 8 years ago. This movement started in the Bay Area in California back in 1969. And it was a movement that was spearheaded by the Black Panther Party. And basically, what it was a defense movement, because the police were murdering our people, and they were murdering them for being involved in the struggle for Black liberation. And so the Black Panther Party, as a defense measure, organized a campaign for community control of the police in Berkeley, California. Okay, I don't want to get into all of the details of that because this will be a real long presentation if I do. But that's how it began. The Alliance, my organization, began here in Chicago in 1973 in the wake of the Defense of Angela Davis movement. That movement grew out of an incident that happened in San Rafael, California, where George Jackson's brother, Jonathan Jackson, was involved in a courtroom scene where he tried to liberate some prisoners. The judge was killed, and Angela Davis was charged with with complicity in that crime, and they had her up for the death penalty. President Nixon and Governor Ronald Reagan had denominated her a terrorist. So we built one of the most massive defense movements in the history of this country around her case. We had over 200 defense committees throughout the country. We had defense committees in 62 different countries, and it was a tremendous victory. In 1972, an all-white jury freed her, and she challenged us as soon as she was freed. She said, "You said free Angela Davis and all political prisoners. What about the rest of the political prisoners?" And in response to that challenge, we formed the National Alliance Against Race and Political Repression here in Chicago in 1973. And one of the main tasks that came out of that conference in terms of us building a mass defense movement was the idea of community control of the police that we got from Fred Hampton and Mark Clark here in Chicago, who also are Black Panther Party martyrs that were murdered in their beds by the Chicago Police Department. And so we took that task up back then, and from then till now, we've been constantly working on developing a legislative approach where we would have fashioned a law that will do the very things that the Panthers were demanding. That is, create an all-elected, all-civilian police accountability council. We finally got that done in 2012 in the wake of the murder of Rekia Boyd here in the city of Chicago. One month after she was murdered, we organized a CPAC campaign. We had 150 different people in the room at the time that we organized it. And we went from 150 people in that room in 2012 to where we have now more than 60,000 people in the community that we have organized in the CPAC campaign, not by getting them to sign a petition, but by actually talking and interacting with them and getting them to say that they support this campaign. Also, since we organized the 60,000 supporters, we also participated in the last election over a year ago for members of the city council. And in that election, there were a number of candidates who ran with a CPAC plank in their platform, and we garnered over 176,000 votes. So we are a mass movement, and we are now 40% of the city council. 19 members of the city council support this movement. We believe we can win this because the people are behind this, and how laws are changed in this country, and how initiatives such as ours become victorious is through the organized might of the people. That's what we believe in. We have faith in the people, and we believe that we can win this if we keep on going in the direction that we're going in.
Thank you, Frank. Robin, well, first, before I go to Robin, I want to remind everyone watching that you can chat with the host and send the host questions, and we're going to get to a couple of questions from the participants as well. Robin, we've heard about CPAC and kind of the history and the struggle from Frank. where, in your view, how does the demand for CPAC gel with your position as co-chair of the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America?
Thanks, Tamer, and thank you, Frank. In my view, I think that socialists need to be fighting to defund the police, to gain community control of the police, and for abolition of the police in prisons. And I think that there's an important role our organization can play in this moment. I think Courtney and Valerie gave some very good explanations of why socialists are critical of policing and think it needs to be abolished. It's not just about getting rid of police and prisons simply, but also about creating a world where we don't need those things. We have been fighting in Chicago DSA for healthcare for all, for climate justice, for housing for all. And these things go hand in hand with fighting to defund the police and also to have community control of the police. I think that one thing I want to share is that in the winter of 2017, I was the field director of Jeanette Taylor, one of our socialist alder people of the 20th Ward. We were out there every Saturday with Frank and members of the Alliance knocking on doors. One of the biggest concerns for people in the 20th Ward was safety. And we talked about why it was important, why community control of the police is important for people's safety, and it resonated with people. So that's another reason I think obviously this demand arose out of a struggle, and even today it still resonates with people on the doors. So that's another reason I'm so excited about where we're at with fighting for this demand.
Frank, I'm sure you've obviously been in this struggle and in this movement for a long time. And I'm sure that there are ebbs and flows that come. And it seems like we're in a very special moment today that we should fight really hard to take advantage of. But obviously there are more people who maybe have heard of CPAC or have not heard about CPAC, but also the idea of defunding and abolition. And I wanted to ask you, when you hear from people, when you talk to people about CPAC and you hear people talking about defunding and abolition, in your opinion, do you think people have one definition of what defunding means or what abolition means? Does everyone agree on what that means, or is there kind of a lot of variance?
Well, there's a lot of variance. I think what we have to look at is the context in which these demands arose, particularly the defund. This is an expression of the fact that people, particularly Black and brown people, are really sick and tired of the police repression, brutality, and terrorism that goes on in their communities unchecked. And so, so that demand comes out of that context. You know, it's a demand or a slogan is great when it reflects the needs and the aspirations and the wishes of the people. But it needs a program to become real. And so we do not, we're not critical of people who say defund the police, nor are we critical of abolitionists, you know, because these are demands that come out of the movement. The only thing that our only response is this, and that is that, yes, defund the police, yes, abolish the police, but how are we going to do it? And, you know, you've already answered that in the presentation that you gave earlier. You know, CPAC is a step in that direction. It's about power. It's about power. If we don't change the power relationships between the police and our communities, then we can't do these things. You know, we have to have power. And that's what CPAC is about. It's about empowering the people to say who polices our communities and how our communities are policed. So with CPAC, we can defund the police, we can demilitarize the police, and we can regulate the police out of existence. But we have to have CPAC as an empowerment of the people in order to do that. So we don't get into idea struggle about well, this can't happen or that can't happen until we get rid of capitalism and so forth and so on. The struggle to get rid of capitalism is now. The struggle to empower the people is now. So it's about what are we doing now? What are we doing in this moment of history? And particularly in this moment of history, when we have one of the largest, deepest rebellions that have taken place in the history of the United States. That's what we have going on now. And it's going on during a pandemic. People are risking their lives to bring about these changes. So this is a moment that we cannot sit idly by and let it pass us by. Now, like never before, we've got to fight for community control of the police as a democratic demand.
Robin, I'm gonna throw it to you and ask you this question. Some people might say, you know what, we have maybe the mayor will agree to cut the police budget, or maybe city council will force the mayor to cut the police budget, or something to that effect. In your experience, do you think it would be realistic and it would be appropriate for someone to rely on whether it's the elected city council or the mayor to take those steps needed towards real defunding and real abolition? Or do you think we need something like what we're talking about here of community control?
Yeah, absolutely not. This mayor, Lori Lightfoot, we have already seen the fact that she won't budge, and she fought the Black-led, youth-led grassroots movements seeking justice for Laquan McDonald before she got in office. And she's continuing the exact same thing. We saw outrageous brutality by the police during this uprising, and Lori Lightfoot has said that they've shown great restraint. So we can see where she stands on this. And even honestly, if it wasn't her, anyone with her funders has an interest in keeping the police, because the people who donate to Lori Lightfoot are the 1%, the capitalist class, and they're the reason we have the police, to protect their property. So no, this, as Frank said, the power comes from the people and from mass organizing.
So let me follow up on that a little bit with you, Frank. There are some, we talk about elected politicians and we talk about their funders. And I want people to understand that simply winning CPAC is not an end of the road, right? One question I've recently gotten from someone is, you want to create this all-elected Civilian Police Accountability Council. Well, what's to stop those moneyed interests we're talking about who are putting people in the mayor's office from electing their own hacks and putting people into the Civilian Police Accountability Council? And I think what I'm getting at is that the movement has to be sustained no matter what happens, because we can't ever depend on someone we put in office to do that. So I want you to sort of tell us a little bit more about, from your experience, even when you get something that you demand, what kind of pressure do we need to continue creating to make sure that our demands are actually followed through?
Well, there's an old spiritual that says freedom is a constant struggle. So when we organize the people to make, and we've learned this, we've learned bitter lessons in history. When we organize people to bring about certain systemic changes, you have to keep that organization going. You have to keep the people organized to fight for those changes, because the enemy which is the system, is our enemy. That's how I look at it. The enemy is always positioning themselves to take back any reform that they are forced to give up, because they don't just give you reform. You know, any reform that they're forced to give up, they'll take back. You know, there's an old saying that they give you a reform with a teaspoon and they take it back with a shovel. You know, so the people have to be ever vigilant. And this also holds true for corruption. Look, there's nothing that's incorruptible. You know, when human beings are involved and whatnot. But we don't let these arguments stop us from fighting for democracy. You know, the only weapon that you have against corruption and co-optation and those type of things is a constant struggle, constantly organizing the people to fight back. You know, we can't just put somebody in office and then, or we can't just get a piece of legislation passed and then go sit down and think things are going to take care of themselves. No, we have to fight for the continuation of our demands to be met. You know, we have to do that, and we have to remember how we got them in the first place. If we got them through the organized struggle of the people, then that's how we keep them. You don't depend on politicians. We don't push politicians, we push issues. You know, the person that says, elect me and I'll set you free is lying. You know, that ain't how it goes. We set ourselves free. This is self-emancipation, you know, not emancipation based on trying to find an Abraham Lincoln. You know, we have to fight for these things ourselves.
Robin, the CDSA chapter priority campaign is kind of titled Defund the Police, Invest in Our Communities. What kind of investments do you envision? And just before I get to actually, I want to mention to people watching, there's something that I just found out today, which is that Chicago, if we reduce our level of spending per capita on police in Chicago from our level to the level that the LAPD has, to the level that Los Angeles spends per capita per person on policing, we would save over $500 million off the bat. And we're not talking about this is the effect of completely eliminating the police. This is just the effect of spending as much money as Los Angeles is spending on policing instead of the amounts that we're spending, which we're in, you know, the top 3, I think. So with that in mind, there's a lot of money that can be freed up for really essential things. And better, and things that are better at reducing violence, reducing harm, helping people, you know, have better lives and so on. So what is your vision for where some of these investments can be made?
Yeah, I think one more reason it's so important to win CPAC and win community control is that when the working class controls the police, I think we'll look around and say, we don't want to spend this much money on the police. We want to spend it on our schools, our healthcare, our housing, and the other things various movements in the city have been fighting for a long time. So what are the things that could help us build a world where we don't need to put people in prisons? That's making sure people have the things they need to live. Like, this is a movement to say, we need the police to stop killing Black people. And it's also a movement to say, we need the things we need to live. That's housing, that's healthcare. We know what a lot of these things are. Schools, obviously, and all of the things we need to get through this crisis we're in, the pandemic, the economic crisis. So that's what I'd like to see us put that more money towards, things that help us survive and live.
Frank, I know that the National Alliance has called for a National Day of Action this Saturday, July 18th. Can you tell people a little bit more about that, what the reason for it is, and what's going to be happening around the country?
Yeah. Well, this is our second National Day of Action we've called since we reformed the National Alliance Against Race and Political Repression back in November of last year. our first day of national action was on May the 30th. On that particular day, we had originally organized 10 cities to respond to this National Day of Action, and 22 ended up responding. You know, we were able to mobilize well over 100,000 people nationally in this National Day of Action, because right after we called it, George Floyd was murdered, and that was the spark that inflamed the world. So we took a lot of momentum from that, and so now this rebellion that came up in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and also the murder of Breonna Taylor and many others, is still going on, and we don't want it to die out. Well, we know rebellions don't die out. You know, rebellions are smashed or killed by those in power. They don't die out. You know, the civil rights movement didn't die out. You know, I mean, it didn't just fade away. You know, it was repressed, and so we know that the only defense against racist and political repression is continued mass struggle. And so we'll call it another day of national protest to put in the center of our demands the demand for community control of the police, because of all of the things that you've said here tonight. You know, this needs to be focused on. Our enemies are going to try to divide these things up, you know, focus on defunding without community control, you know, focus on demilitarization in the abstract, budget shifts, you know, more neoliberalism, you know. So we don't want that, you know. We want our people to be focused, and we want the struggle for community control of the police to become what it has the potential of becoming in this period, and it is one of the most massive democratic struggles in the history of this country. We want to make that happen, and it's not going to happen if we don't make it happen.
Yeah, one of the things I think you said to me once recently, we don't want to get lost in the sauce.
Don't want to get lost in the sauce.
Yep.
It's a lot of sauce out there right now.
And it seems
I hear Soros is going to be auctioning off millions and millions of dollars to NGOs and community-based organizations in this period, particularly those that quote unquote are fighting against racism.
Mm-hmm. And that actually brings me to my next question, which is, and I'm going to start with you, Robin, and then I'm going to ask you, Frank, the same question. What do you think people out there should be on the lookout for? As someone who is someone in the movement, someone who is fighting for justice, what are the kind of tricks or other plays that we can expect that we should be on the lookout for, and to make sure to sort of keep our eye on the prize?
There's a lot of tricks up their sleeve. As Frank mentioned, I think co-optation is one strategy they take against us. And we mentioned 8 can't wait. Well, liberal reforms that don't actually get toward abolition, that aren't transformational, body cameras, trainings, these things don't work. I think we're going to have to be vigilant against that. One thing that goes along with that is I think they're going to continue to try to use race to divide us as the working class. And that's another thing. I think with this movement, it's been really inspiring to see that there's been multiracial solidarity with Black people on the streets in Chicago that I've seen. So I hope that we can continue to build a multiracial movement.
Yeah.
And I also know, Robin, I think there's Well, no, I know that tomorrow there is also a rally that all of our organizations are participating in. Can you tell people a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a Black Indigenous Solidarity Rally. Honestly, I don't have the exact location. Maybe somebody else, I can pull it up, or somebody else can
I think
put it
it's
in
a
the
Buckingham
chat.
Fountain. At Buckingham Fountain.
Oh, that's right. That's right. It's at 5 p.m. So yes, please come out if you're able. I'm going to be there. Hope to see you, comrades.
Frank, I'm going to come to you with the same question that that I asked Robin. What should you have maybe a few years on Robin, you know, not that many, but a few years.
You got jokes.
So I want to ask you, what should people be on the lookout for in terms of how you were saying earlier, rebellions don't fizzle out, they get repressed. What should people be on the lookout for?
Well, you know, I would say it's the same thing that Robin just pointed out. You know, it's hard for them to come up with new tricks, and we've saw all of their old tricks, you know, but that don't mean that they're not going to stop trying. Main things that I think people should be aware of is that when they say defund the police, and they and they say we're going to take $150 million and cut it out of the budget, or even if they say we're going to take a billion and cut it out of the budget, you know, the people who are doing the cutting, are not people who have historically had our best interest at heart. So what we got to do, we got to teach the people, don't trust those who created the problem in the first place. That's what we have to do, and that will short circuit a whole lot of these tricks, you know, these politicians have up their sleeve. You know, don't trust those who create the problem in the first place. That's why we need community control of the police. You know, the reform bills that they're putting through Congress right now, pay attention to them, because they're not addressing the basic question. What do the people want? What are the people's demands? The first demand that comes out when somebody's child is murdered is they want justice. They want the police that did the murder arrested, charged, and convicted and sent to jail. That's the first thing that comes up, you know. Now, a lot of these reform bills, they're not even dealing with that. They're dealing with about retraining the police, psychological profiling, reprofiling them, and so forth and so on, you know. And the reason why they don't address that is because we're not involved in it. If the parents of the people who have been murdered was involved in the process, they would be coming up with a different kind of bill, you know. And so, but they are involved in our movement. Our movement is fueled by those people who have been murdered and tortured by the police. That's what makes our movement happen. And so our movement is going to see through the tricks. We're going to see through them. You know, they're not going to trick us, you know, but people who we're trying to organize, people who we're trying to bring into our movement, we have to be vigilant in letting them know that these piecemeal reforms are not going to work. What we need to have is community control of the police. We're not talking about oversight. You know, we're not talking about the police investigating themselves. We're talking about you, our community, being in charge of the process. That's what we're talking about. Now, they can't trick us out of that. If we stick to it, you know, it won't happen. But that's the job we got to do. You know, we got to make sure that our people are kept up and involved and engaged in organizing to bring about community control of the police, and not get off into some reformist blind alleys that don't lead anywhere. Because they're going to try to lure us off into those places. You know, some of them are going to embrace the defund thing. Some of them are going to say, oh, like the mayor did out in California. I heard that there was I can't remember the town right now, but a friend of mine just told me that there was some town in Carolina that is for reparations for black folks, but they don't have no money. Town doesn't have no money. So, but they voted for reparations, you know. So be on the lookout for things like that. You know?
Right. I think that's a great. I think that's a great spot to end this. When you were talking, I just remembered when everyone was saying defund or everyone was saying reform. People were saying defund, and then I think Joe Biden came out and said, "Let's give them $300 million more so they can figure out how to police better." It's that kind of. I'm really glad to hear from both of you about what people should be on the lookout for. We're almost out of time, and we want to make sure to give people a chance to hear about some of the next steps that they can take. So it's been a real pleasure talking to you both. Robin and Frank, it's really nice having you. And thank you so much for making time out of your busy schedules to be with us. And I will now send it over to Nick to tell people how they can do more. Thank you both.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Nick, and I'm also with the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America. Before we leave, we want to connect this wide-ranging discussion to concrete next steps for winning CPAC and defunding the police. In the chat, you will find a link to a Google document listing all the steps you see on the slide. First, if you're comfortable doing so, attend some protests. There are 2 events this weekend that you can join: the Black Indigenous Solidarity Rally on Friday and the the Chicago National Day of Protest Car Caravan on Saturday. Second, we can all deepen our political education around abolition as a socialist demand by joining the first summer session of Socialist Night School this Sunday. We also include in the document a link to a reading list on police and prison industrial complex abolition. Third, we want you to participate in ongoing organizing for CPAC. You can get involved with Chicago's DSA's defund campaign, which includes work on CPAC, getting cops out of schools, and defunding CPD by filling out both of the forms linked in that document. Fourth, we want to really ask folks to call both their alderman and mayor about CPAC. In the Google document, you'll find a link to a call guide that will help you identify your alderperson if you don't know who they are. It will tell you if your alderperson already supports CPAC and gives you guidance on what to say when you call your alderperson. Lastly, please consider following, joining, and supporting the organizations leading the fight for CPAC, like Black Lives Matter Chicago, Black Youth Project 100, the Torture Justice Center, or the Brave Space Alliance, and many more. In closing, we want to extend gratitude to Frank Chapman, Executive Director of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Oppression, as well as co-chair of CARPER, and also Robin Peterson, co-chair from the Chicago Democratic Socialists of America, for being here to educate us. Thanks to Michael, Courtney, and Valerie, local Chicago DSA members, for presenting at the beginning of the presentation. And also thanks to Lee Costanza for the graphic for tonight's presentation. We want to thank all of you for being here to educate yourself and to figure out how to get involved. And we want to express love and solidarity to the protesters, organizers, and all those sacrificing around the country, fighting for an end to the murders of Black and brown people at the hands of police, and to end policing as we know it. With that, we want to say that we here at CDSA are honored to have all of you as comrades in this fight. Good night. Good night to everyone.